Here's one here by Año Nuevo. So here it says, notice to pilots. Pilots are requested to maintain a minimum altitude of 2,000 feet AGL over the Año Nuevo State Reserve. That's for the sea lions they have there. So the next item down I wanted to show was the military training route. And most military training routes are rather simple, just a thin charcoal gray line. In fact, this is actually a military training route here. But I'm going to go down towards Santa Barbara. And here we can show a military training route over here that's labeled IR 211. The IR stands for instrument route, and any three-digit number for a military training route means that aircraft could fly below 10,000 feet all the way down to the surface faster than 250 knots. We discussed before that normally aircraft below 10,000 feet MSL don't exceed 250 knots, but these are special routes where the military can go faster for training purposes. And this is just a plain military training route. There's one that has a gray hatching, just like they use for the warning areas or the restricted areas, around it, and it kind of gives a truer sense of how wide they are. They're not just a little very thin line. They're actually the size of a Victor airway, which is 8-mile width or 4 nautical miles to the either side that the military aircraft can fly. And the military training route is just showing the center line of that area. What they use this charcoal hatching for is to show you a segment of the military training route where the military is restricted or not using all of the altitudes that would normally be available. So in this case, the lower altitude for this portion of this military training route that would normally be with a three-digit identifier or name the military would have from the surface all the way up to 10,000 feet MSL. In this case, they're self-restricting themselves to 3,000 feet AGL for the lower altitude limit and 7,000 MSL for the higher altitude limit. So you'll just find those aircraft between 3 and 7,000 feet. And if you do happen to see, I didn't see one right on here, but if you do happen to see a VR, that's visual route, and if you see a 4-digit name for the military training route, or 4 numbers, that means that that particular route is restricted just below 1,500 feet AGL, so from 0 to 1,500 feet AGL. All right, I'm going to go back to the San Francisco Bay Area to show a national security area. And we'll scroll over. Or scroll up to just east of Livermore Airport. And this national security area is very small. It doesn't really look like the thick dashed magenta lines that the typical national security area would look like. This is so small that they've just colored like an orange circular blob on the chart. But this lies just east of the city of Livermore, and it's in kind of a strange location in a little bit of the undeveloped land just east of Lawrence Livermore Lab. But there's a clear notice here in a magenta box that says, notice for reasons of national security, pilots are requested to avoid flight at or below 800 feet in this area. And it does sound like just a request, but I always make sure and stay more than 800 feet in that area. And then the next place we're going to go is down to the Palm Springs area east of Los Angeles to look at a, turn off the mouse there, to look at a terminal radar service area. There we go. I had to click around a little bit for it. This is a little bit east of Los Angeles, and Palm Springs and several other airports in here are fairly busy, and they're kind of constrained by a mountain range on each side, so there's a little valley where there's a decent amount of traffic. And air traffic control did not make this, or the FAA did not make this area a Class Charlie airspace where getting radar service or flight following would have been mandatory through this area, but they are encouraging pilots or recommending pilots to get radar service or flight following from air traffic controllers in this area. So the way they depict a terminal radar service area is with thick charcoal lines. You can see an outline here, although it's a little bit obscured by the magenta shading. And then you can see some charcoal lines around the Palm Springs airport itself. For the core right around Palm Springs, the altitude of the Tersa is surface to 10,000 feet, and then outside of that core area, the altitudes are 3,500 MSL to 10,000 MSL. And I have flown down to the Palm Springs area, and I just get flight following, and then you're complying with the idea of getting radar service to help yourself avoid collisions in those busier areas. Okay, now we're off to the Grand Canyon to look at a special flight rules area. This is the Grand Canyon Airport, and this is the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River. I'm kind of zoomed in right here so you can't see it as well. I'll zoom out in a little bit. But they have a strange depiction where you see a blue line and then these little squares along the blue line. And this is an area, they're depicting areas where you cannot fly from the surface up to, in this case, 9999 MSL, or essentially 10,000 feet MSL. So you can fly above 10,000 feet MSL and look around the Grand Canyon in various places, but you're not supposed to fly lower than 10,000 feet MSL. One other special thing about the flight rules area would be these purple areas are areas where most aircraft cannot fly at all. You'd have to be a tour operator to fly in these purple areas, and they're high levels of tour traffic, or they're areas where they don't want aircraft flying at all so people can enjoy the Grand Canyon in complete silence. So I'll zoom out a little bit. And then you can see a bit more of the chart and how large it is. So again, this is the Grand Canyon Airport and the Colorado River. And any of these purple areas are no-flight areas, and there are different altitudes that you can fly in different sectors, like above 10,000 feet or above 8,000 feet or so on. But needless to say, if you're going in the Grand Canyon area, you need to make sure and get that special Grand Canyon VFR chart. All right, and then that covers most of the special use airspace areas. The remaining one is the temporary flight restrictions. And the way I like to find out about temporary flight restrictions is to go to duats.com. So after you've logged into Duats, then you can go to the flight restrictions, and I like the temporary flight restrictions from CSC, which is the Computer Science Corporation, or the company that has the government contract for Duats.com. And then if you click on that where it says Graphic See Note, then this window comes up, and this is showing the United States, and the states that don't have any temporary flight restrictions would just be white, and then the states that do have temporary flight restrictions present are pink. And then wherever you see red is a temporary flight restriction. And what I did to bring up this other window I'll bring up in a moment is put my cursor over the temporary flight restriction in Northern California, which happens to be around Beale Air Force Base. And then once you click on that, another window will come up. And this shows the plotted area of the temporary flight restriction. It's possible for you to confirm if they've plotted it correctly by looking at the data block here. This particular point says that it's a 10 nautical mile radius of a point defined by, and then they say Marysville VOR 55 degree radial at 6.7 miles. So they went to the Marysville VOR went out 6.7 miles on the proper radial, and then drawn a circle with a 10-mile radius. And it roughly covers the extent of the Class Charlie airspace. And if you look, the altitude restriction is that from 4,100 feet MSL up to 18,000 feet is the area of coverage for the temporary flight restriction. And to make a long story short, this temporary flight restriction is truly not like most of the temporary flight restrictions where you can't fly in. Like if there was a forest fire or something like that, they'll outline an area where you're just not supposed to fly. This temporary flight restriction is for unmanned aerial vehicle operations. So the military tests unmanned aerial vehicles, and they fly them not only in the Charlie airspace, where you have to talk to air traffic control anyway, but they fly them above the Class Charlie airspace as well. And normally you can fly above 4,100 feet over the Beale Class Charlie airspace without talking to air traffic control. You just have to have a Mode C transponder. But in this case, since the unmanned aerial vehicles don't have any pilots in them looking to avoid collisions, the only way to ensure the separation of an unmanned aerial vehicle and your aircraft is for air traffic control to separate you. So they've essentially extended the Class Charlie airspace, or the effective Class Charlie airspace, up to 18,000 feet and said if you're going to fly over Beale Air Force Base, you need to contact air traffic control and get radar service so they can separate you from any possible unmanned aerial vehicles. And I believe that's it. I'm going to go back to the temporary flight restriction. Well, there was one other note. My least favorite part of temporary flight restrictions are that the ones that we just looked at are great because you can actually easily see where they are and what their times of use are. But there are temporary flight restrictions that are a little bit harder to determine, and those are the ones for sporting events or large outdoor assemblages of people, like for NASCAR races or baseball or football games. So what I call the oxymoronic standing temporary flight restriction, because it's kind of contradictory there to have a standing temporary flight restriction. But if you have a sporting event that has more than a 30,000 seating capacity, 30,000 person seating capacity, then you're supposed to avoid that area by 3 nautical miles and 3,000 feet for an hour before the event start time to an hour after the event end time. And the difficult part about doing this is that it's not available through the link we just looked at on DUATS. You just have to know where these stadiums are and when the sporting events are. So one of the ways to avoid this, if you're not exactly sure where they are and don't follow all the baseball games and football games and NASCAR races, would be just to fly greater than 3,000 feet AGL whenever you're flying somewhere, and then you wouldn't have to worry about going through one. And if you are in a populated area and you talk to air traffic control, and air traffic control gives you a certain route, then you're actually allowed to fly through one of these sporting event or stadium temporary flight restrictions. A good example is if you're going to land at Palo Alto. Let's see if I can get back to the Bay Area. If you're going to approach Palo Alto from the Woodside VOR or the Stanford Linear Accelerator from the southwest towards the airport, then you'd fly close to Stanford Stadium. And if Stanford's having a football game, then Palo Alto ATIS will announce that there's a sporting event temporary flight restriction in effect. But if you report slack and the tower tells you to make left traffic or right traffic or something like that, and you proceed towards the airport, it's okay to fly through one of these sporting event TFRs if you're in contact with air traffic control and coordinating your flight with them. And that's the end of Part B of my airspace presentation.